It is not up for debate that the best era in the Barbie cinematic universe was the early 2000s, especially when Mattel adapted popular ballets and the very few fairy tales that hadn't already been swallowed by IP greedy Disney. Like, did you know we could have gotten Barbie as Sleeping Beauty? It's an injustice. My favorite of this era has always been 2003's Barbie of Swan Lake, which I loved so much as a child that I even took and failed at ballet lessons for a hot minute. It has spawned a very lifelong obsession and my self-given title as a Barbie movie expert. Seriously, I've seen almost everything to this day, except the very hard to find Barbie and the Rockers out of this world. So, with Comic-Con coming up very soon, it's no surprise that I'm entering the cosplay competition with a dress from this film. While, okay, there are a lot of great outfits in this movie, such as this and this, not to mention Odette continually proving that villain is always code for best dress. But I had to go with her most iconic, her final transformation look. Well, no, not her final gown, which has what I think are really tacky sleeve things, but the ball version she wears for a much longer in the runtime. But before I could even begin to wrap my head around this skirt, bodice, and all of the glittery feathers, or are they supposed to be leaves? I don't know, sound off in the comments or something. I'm going to need the right undergarments in order to best build out the shape, namely a corset and a romantic tutu. A lot of the fun of this project has been researching theatrical costuming techniques for ballet, which I'll be doing my best to implement in this project. Oh, classical tutu, you will have your day one day. So this all starts with creating the corset so that I can whittle my body down into those very realistic and very unharmful Barbie proportions. In at first, I bought a bunch of fabrics for this project, including a lot of tulle and glittery stuff that is pretty much all over my house. But the corset will be made from this periwinkle blue polyester satin and lined with some leftover blue cotton from my stash. You can actually find this pattern for this corset for free from Aranea Black. She has a great sizing range and even provides YouTube tutorials on how to alter and use the patterns. I highly recommend. I've altered the Dolores pattern from her to include a little bit more hip spring to really further drive the illusion of that teeny tiny Barbie waist. The first step after cutting is flatlining the satin to the cotton. This is the long process wherein I base the panels together so that the two pieces can behave as one. Ideally, you'd use something much sturdier like a cotton twill or a coutil, which is not easy to find in South Africa, by the way. But I'd already spent quite a bit of money on the materials for this project, and I try as much as possible to always make the most use of what I already have. I also thread marked the waistline on each panel so that I could easily make sure everything was perfectly aligned for sewing later. Yes, thread marking is tedious and boring and lame, but it's a better system for being able to see the markings on both sides of a piece of fabric than something like chalk. The corset is actually 12 panels, 6 on each side, which meant I had to work 24 panels, 12 in the cotton and then 12 in the satin, into the original 12 panels. Weirdly enough, or maybe not, sewing up the seams together is the easiest part of this process. And if not easy, then the quickest. I decided that I would use the seam lines as boning channels, so then these had to be pressed open and trimmed down before being bound with bias tape. Even with all of my hours of basting, I wasn't as careful as I could have been about placing the bias tape directly on the center of the seam lines. But I've had to keep reminding myself that this is just underwear. No one's meant to see it. So let's just keep this between us. Okay, cool. Thank you. Despite the fact that I've made a few successful corsets before, this project was a battle. Like, I was fighting for my life. I was trapping with the demons. It was me against the wall, landlord at the door. The lights were out. It's always been advised to me that you should sew boning channels in one direction in order to prevent the fabric from puckering, and that has always worked for me previously, but for some reason on this day, this fabric hated me specifically. It was out to get me. It wanted to see my downfall. Upon trying it on, I did realize that my neckline was way too high and that I was going to need more boning channels to even out the puckering. Fun fact, a little bit of a spoiler, I was wrong. But it was fortunate because I'd kind of forgotten about adding a waistbay before this point. The waistbay is just a piece of tape that's anchored at the waistline and stitched down with the boning channels, and it serves to sort of ease the tension off of the seams at this point, since this is the highest point of stress and where you'd most likely see the fabric rip, or your seams rip actually. Here's a fun eco sewing tip that I cannot shut up about. Save all of your basting threads. You can use them later as basting threads again. This is also really useful and really good to do when you're like me and you work primarily with polyester thread, which, as you know, doesn't actually, break down. I keep all of this on my makeshift highlighter spool and I just reuse them until there's basically nothing left to reuse again. The boning I'm using for this corset is something called Rigeline or Rigeline, though I've also seen it referred to as polyester boning. Historically, steel and whalebone would have been used, and while a lot of people think that this is actually what makes the corset so constrictive, it's actually just there to stiffen the garment and provide support to the tightness of the garment. The waist reduction and the shaping comes from the sewing pattern itself. I usually prefer to use what's called synthetic whalebone, a plastic that mimics the properties of whalebone. It takes on the shape of your body after being exposed to your body heat. For some reason, no one in this country wants to get up and sell the good stuff anymore. Yeah, the stuff is serviceable, but not nearly as sturdy and stiff. I made several attempts to iron out all the puckers, but nothing could fix the fact that I'd chosen the wrong fabric. If there's anything you can take away from this project, it's always to go with tightly woven fabric wherever possible, no matter how much you love the periwinkle blue stuff. It's so pretty, am I right? Now that the corset was essentially built, I could put in the closures. Don't ask me why, but I am terrified of metal grommets and eyelets, and I find hooks and eyes very annoying to install, as well as not having any access to the kind that could take the kind of stress a corset would entail. So I always go with hand stitch eyelets. This is surprisingly very relaxing, and they hold up just as well as metal eyelets for me. I punched holes into the fabric with a leather punch and then sewed around them with white embroidery floss. The final step was finishing the top and the bottom edges, which I did with bias binding cut from the same fabric. For no real reason, I like to hand stitch this down after machine sewing it. I'm making very careful stitches that only go through the cotton fabric so that they don't show on the satin on the outside. Oh, okay, I lied. The actual finer steps are flossing the boning channels so that the boning won't tear through the fabric, and then using up all of those scraps to make pads to insert into the hip and bust areas to further really make the waist look much smaller. For the romantic tutu, I cut 3 6-meter long panels of tulle. Romantic tutus seem to be the prototype of tutus in general, taking their shape and their name from the 1830s when they came about. The tutus we think about today are referred to as classical tutus, like those big pancakey ones, and I am dying for the day I can make one of those. I followed a tutorial by Liam to make this romantic tutu, starting with drafting the basque on myself. The basque is the panel that covers the waist and hips that will essentially hold all of the layers of tulle. These aren't sewn all together on like one line of stitching and put into the waist in order to prevent unnecessary bulk at this point. It's also a much nicer looking method in my eyes, and I think frankly probably a lot easier. Even though I am someone with a love of full skirts, I haven't bothered to ever purchase a gathering foot because I figured out that you can just make your ordinary sewing machine gather fabric for you by messing with the tension. I put my tension on 9, the highest, while using my longest stitch length to get automatic gathering. It's not a foolproof method all the time, but it's pretty handy with dealing with 18 meters of fabric. I top stitch the gathered tulle to the basque, being mindful to catch the edge and not stitch over the previous layers. This was surprisingly quick. I think this whole project took me about 6 hours in total, the tutu I mean. Here's how they came out. I am mostly happy with how this project turned out. The corset could have been much, much better, but I've worn it out a few times and it holds well while being really comfortable. Comic-Con is on the 24th of September at the time of recording, with the Master of Cosplay deadline being on the 14th of September. So there really isn't time to fuss with stuff that no one is actually going to see. Please join me next week when I make the skirt. Let me know what your favorite Barbie movie is and why it's probably The Princess and the Pauper so that I can yell at you. Bye!